Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Achieving Successful Security Segmentation. Today's event is brought to you by Illumio and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is David Davis, and I'm excited to be your moderator on today's event. Before we get started, we have a little bit of housekeeping we first need to cover. Most importantly, we want this to be a really educational event. We want you to learn as much about segmentation, microsegmentation, all those types of things. We want you to learn as much as possible. So feel free to use the questions box there in the GoToWebinar control panel to ask as many questions as you'd like. And we have a dedicated Q&A session coming up at the end of the event. So we'll be queuing up the best questions for that session. So make sure you get your questions in early. So as you think of a question, just pop it right in that box. I also want to point out that we have a couple handouts available for download there, also in the GoToWebinar control panel. The first one is the 5 new rules to secure dynamic data centers and clouds. Make sure you download that one. And there's another one there called the inevitable cost of status quo security, paying the inaction tax. So make sure you check out those 2 PDFs, and you can click to download those directly to your local computer and check them out after the event. And then finally, for one lucky attendee on today's event, we have a $300 Amazon gift card that we'll be giving away at the end of the event. The full price terms and conditions can be found at events.actualtechmedia.com. And without further delay, I'm excited to introduce our presenter on today's event. That is Mr. Faraz Aladin, Technical Product Marketing, or Head of Technical Product Marketing at Illumio. Faraz, thanks for being on the event today.
Thank you for having us. It's a pleasure.
I'm excited to see what you've got lined up for us today. I've kind of skimmed the presentation, but I haven't seen it in action yet. So I know the audience is waiting to hear what you have to share with us today about microsegmentation, what it is, how it works, how to get started. So take it away, Faraz.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time and attending today's session. My name is Faraz Aladin, as David mentioned, and over the course of next hour or so, I wanted to share with you some of the things that we have learned in the company and from customers, how they have gone about solving some of the security challenges they have in their environment and doing it successfully. So let's straight dive into it. What we will be doing today is we'll talk a little bit about what is security segmentation. We have all heard the word segmentation and security. What is security segmentation? So we'll take a little look at that and see how is that different. We will also see what are some of the challenges that are associated with traditional way of sort of segmenting networks. And we will come up with the new model, which most of our customers have landed on whenever they have decided to move in segmentation, and they have done it successfully. The one common denominator we have found in all of our customers is this sort of notion of decoupling, and we'll walk through that. We'll take a look at some of the guiding principles of what makes a segmentation project successful, and then leave you with some key strategic ways or steps to take when you have these projects in your environment. So without further ado, let's quickly get into it. So what is security segmentation? Before we get into it, let's see what are the drivers. Why is this whole security thing a big deal? So first thing, security has always been top of mind for everybody. We all want to secure things in our daily lives, in our businesses, etc. But in the last few years, especially when it comes to enterprise organizations and their networks, there has been a heightened sense of urgency in terms of security and making sure that the environment is secure, the applications are secure, the data remains secure, etc. So what is driving this heightened sense of urgency? I like to think in terms of this trifecta that's driving this. The first is, as I see, is the rise of the hybrid cloud. So it's no secret enterprises are, adopting public cloud in droves, and actually many of them remain in that hybrid status where they still have many of the things they have in their on-prem environment, but also want to take advantage of the public cloud and everything that it offers. By doing that, what actually you're doing is you are increasing your attack surface. Basically, you have a footprint that was relegated only to your public, to your on-prem data center, but now you have a footprint in other places as well. So essentially, you just have a surface that is bigger than what you had in terms of where your compute resides, which means more places that bad actors can come in and try to get in. So that's sort of the first thing, rise of the hybrid cloud. So again, public clouds offer tremendous opportunities. So don't see this as something that people should not do, but look at it in the light of that, yes, this got tremendous advantages. It does bring in some challenges. How do we solve that? The second is this rise in cyber attacks. If you're looking at the chart, it's filled with all kinds of information. But the one thing I want you to walk away from it is if you look from left to right, the intensity and the frequency of these attacks have been on the rise. They have happened more frequently. There's much more damage that is done. And the view in general in the industry is that there is a lot of money that has been spent in the last 10 years in security technologies and products, and the results have not been at par with what customers would like to achieve. And in many cases, it's not the technology problem. It is in terms of how the technology has been deployed, and sometimes it solves a lot of people and processes. The third vector, as I see it, is sort of the rise of the regulator. Now, given the number of breaches, and those breaches that happen in very critical environments like financial industries or patient data and things like that, the regulators that control these environments are responsible, have actually become more stringent. The regulations themselves have become very tight, and the regulators are coming down, because ultimately most of these organizations and the regulators with behind them, whether it's SWIFT or GDPR or HIPAA or HITRUST, all of these guys, what they really want to do is reduce the risk, the systemic risk in the environment. So the regulators are actually coming down in more frequently, I guess, or in the timeline that they see, and they're more strict. So this trifecta of rise of the public cloud, the rise in terms of breaches, and the rise of the regulator, that has sort of prompted customers to say, I need to do something and make myself more secure. So what is this security segmentation? Or if we even think, what is segmentation? Well, this metaphor actually might help us understand that. So if you're looking at the slide, you see submarines on the screen, the one on the left-hand side and the one on the right-hand side. Well, people don't construct submarines the way it's shown on the left-hand side. And the reason for that is that while it has a lot of room to move around, if you do have a breach, that submarine is probably going to sink. But the one on the right-hand side will probably stay because it's been segmented. So even if that took in water, the water only got into that compartment in that segment. Now, if you take this concept and apply it to your data center, you can start to see the similarities. Your data center is like a large layer 2 flat any-to-any connectivity environment. Should somebody breach the north-south firewall and get into your environment, they can have a field day roaming around left to right. And the goal is to break that attack surface by segmenting. And that's really the concept. And why is this so important is because typically what you see is in the case of breaches or unauthorized access, it is not that the bad guys or unauthorized users are actually crying and saying, I'm going to go and attack that database and try to get into it. It typically happens by way of lateral movement. They will actually try and get a foothold in some unsupervised or low level or loose password or site that is not very important to the business or things like that. We all know of cases where Target, where somebody got into the HVAC system, or that casino where people got into an internet-connected fish tank. So the problem is the one of lateral movement, and that's what really segmentation is solving, is that you want to be able to stop that lateral movement by unauthorized users if they do come into your environment breaching the north-south firewall. So that is the concept of segmentation. And security segmentation is nothing but segmenting the network for security purposes. So people have used segmentation to do other things as well. People do segmentation for network performance, so you can drive the traffic in the right way. Or people do segmentation to get some automation done for configurations, etc. But what we really are talking about, segmentation for the purpose of securing your applications and stopping that lateral movement. Okay, so let's get into it, where the notion of segmentation is there and where we stand currently and how do we move forward. So one might be thinking that, well, segmentation, it's great, but this concept is not new. I mean, we have had segmentation from the day we start connecting things together. We have had, the concept of VLANs and broadcast domains and subnets and firewall zones and all of these things. So why can't we just use that and move ahead? Well, as it happened, the challenges are many. So if I take a step back and just look at the infrastructure that people have today, it demands a lot more agility, right? Businesses want to put services out there. They want to differentiate themselves, and they want to be able to cater to their customers, and they just need more agility from their systems, their applications, and applications reside on the network. And basically it comes down to is that, can I travel at the speed of my business so that I can provide the services, the network, the security, and everything else that is demanding or that is demanded by the business. The second, environments have become more complex. Things are not as just neatly laid out in racks in our data center. Here I have this subnet and these servers. People today deal with a mix of bare metal servers, virtual machines, containers. They could be on-prem, they could be in hosted environments, in public clouds, multiple public ones, and you have partner networks, vendor networks. So suffice to say, the environment that is today is definitely much more complex than what we would have seen 5-10 years ago, or maybe in some cases even a few years ago. And last but not the least, as I mentioned, security is top of mind for everybody. So as business leaders are saying, I want more agility in my environment, they're also saying, I want this agility to come with security. It should not be a either or situation. So these three things that are driving the challenges in the infrastructure play a big role in how customers do security segmentation. And the challenge that customers face when they try to segment the network as they see today, we see three things that come out time and again. One is poor app visibility. We have lots of tools today in the enterprise world that give us network maps and tell you how packets are flowing. But when you really want to secure your environment and secure applications, you need visibility into how your applications are communicating with each other, as well as within the tiers of the same application. And without this visibility, you do not have a very good chance of succeeding at driving security policies, because what you can't see, you can't secure. Second, the environments are very heterogeneous. You don't just have a bare metal server or virtual machine or one type of compute in one place. You have a complex environment. It consists of many, many things. You might still have your legacy systems like AS400. You might have bare metal running on Solaris AIX. You might have your virtual infrastructure. You probably are migrating towards containers. So all of these things combined, it really makes it, I wouldn't say hard, but it certainly needs more visibility so that you can actually see how things are working and have mechanisms to deal with all these different environments. You don't want a separate solution for a separate environment. And the third problem that people face is basically complex security policies. The policies have gotten more and more complex because now you have all of these different applications that may be on-prem, in the cloud, or using services that now need to talk to each other, because applications need to talk to each other. They don't remain on an island, right? That's how business works. So now you need to devise policies, and they sometimes become fairly complex when you are doing it the way with the traditional mechanisms, and we'll expand on that. So really what it comes down to is some of the mechanisms that are available today, they actually fall short. So today, one could say, well, I can do segmentation in my network using my network because I understand the network, I understand the devices, the switches, the routers, the firewalls. I'm just going to use those to do it. Okay, great. That's one way to do it. Or you could say, I'm going to deploy SDN because I understand a lot of this stuff is probably going to need to be automated, and I don't really have all of the things, the manpower and things. So I'm going to use automation to do this thing with SDN. Now, the challenge with both these approaches is that, for one, let's say firewalls, you have different administration points. So even if you say I'm going to have my north-south firewall, and now within my data center, as I want to keep segmenting, I'm going to put a firewall, internal data center firewall, and then create zones and put stuff in zones, and then write policies which zone can talk to which zone. You do have multiple administration points that you need to actually now configure this firewall for. Right? Even if you had a single pane of glass where you can configure all the different firewalls inside your data center, these still are different firewalls. And you are creating a choke point, if you will, because you're going to bring up all of the data or a lot of the traffic from a set of devices and then bring it up, funnel it up into one firewall. And the capacity of that firewall is going to be the key, how much bandwidth is coming in, and those hardware boxes are not cheap. The second thing is the policy is intricately tied to IP addresses, which it means is that if you have an application that grew over time and have now got 50, 60 workloads participating in that application, and they are now in different subnets, different VLANs, because it organically grew over time, you now have a challenge that all of these policies that you have defined to secure that application are based on IP addresses, and all these workloads are in different environments. Now, try writing a policy using IP addresses for just, let's say, 10 or 20 workloads that make up an application where everybody's talking to each other. You'll probably have an access list that is 300, 400 lines long. That is if you don't blow out your TCAM. So the point being that the mechanisms we use today, they're intricately tied to IP addresses, and there is a fundamental challenge with that. I'll expand on that. The other is applications are not conveniently located relative to network boundaries, which is what I tried to allude to earlier, is if all of your workloads for a particular application were neatly laid out in a VLAN or in a subnet, you can, yeah, sure, I can write one line of access list and say that, yep, this particular subnet is can only talk to this or that, and it might be easy. But that's not life, because you have your workloads that make up the applications across all different VLANs and subnets and crisscrossing boundaries, which makes it very difficult to write policies based on those IP addresses and VLANs. And last but not the least, you actually find that the capabilities that you have on your network devices are inconsistent. Your access layer switch in the wiring closet may not have the same capabilities in terms of granularity or the TCAM sizes, or just even the enforcement capabilities that you may find in your aggregation and core layer devices or firewalls. So really the challenge is one of administration, the one of the construct that we use today, which are networking constructs, and actually how the environments are laid out today. So really what it comes out is that these approaches, they fall short, and the impact of it is not just technological impact, right? I mean, what it really means is that if you can't really drive accurate policies, then you have increased the risk in your environment, right? If you cannot manage those policies well, then essentially you have created a posture that is very fragile. That means if you need to change things, applications move, workloads move, which happens all the time, you really have a challenge because policies will break, or you need to put an undue amount of effort to make sure that they stay that way. And clearly, because you're afraid of making these changes, or things could break, or you have more risk, you really are providing no agility or very little agility, because you're fearful of failure, of what will happen if I make these changes. So there's an actual real impact to the business because of these particular things. So how do we solve this problem? Well, I think there is a way that actually makes it far easier to solve this problem. Let me sort of walk you through an analogy, and that will help you. If you're looking at this slide, on the left-hand side, you see freeways. The job of the freeway is to get you from point A to point B as fast as you can. And we want to provide as much bandwidth as we can, the number of lanes, etc. And that's like your network. The thing on the right-hand side that you see is basically a toll booth, where we need to stop, or they ask you to stop, and we collect the money because we got to pay for the roads. And the whole point of this is that you're going to come to stop, we're going to do things, and then you can go. Now, these two are very diametrically opposite ideas. Your freeway is like your network, and your toll booth is like your security. Now, both these diametrically opposite ideas have to coexist. And we, as a society, solved that problem. How did we do that? By decoupling the two. We decouple the driving on the road aspect from collecting the tolls. What we did is we put an overlay, which is the transponders. So drive as fast as you can, and the transponder will read the information, and we will collect the toll. So we have done this thing where both these opposing ideas can coexist, and life is good. Such is the case with security as well. You can actually do this right. But to do this thing, you actually have to make an architectural shift. And that shift comes in the form of breaking the linkage, meaning, or not the linkage, I should say, but the construct that you are using for security today. So when you decouple security from networking architecture, they both actually are self-sufficient blocks and can move at the right speed and keep up with the business. So how is it done? Now, before we get there, I wanted to get a feel for how things are moving ahead. So David and my partner in crime over here, we figured we will probably reach out to our audience and get to know a little bit from them about how they are seeing these kinds of projects.
Absolutely. So I want to call everyone's attention out there in the audience to the poll question on the screen. It says, are you considering or actively pursuing a segmentation project? So is this something you're working on right now, or even just considering doing it at some point in the future? So it's a simple yes or no question, shouldn't take too long to answer. While the audience is working on that, Faraz, I'm curious, I mean, what's the most common kind of initiator for a new segmentation project that you've seen out there at real companies?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, people don't wake up one fine day and say, all right, I'm going to do segmentation. I'm going to go ahead and start doing segmentation. Typically, what we find that there is a compelling reason and a driver to do it. In many cases, that compelling reason or driver tends to be compliance. So if you're a financial institution, you are using SWIFT, or you're a member of the SWIFT organization, well, you can get audited every year. So you have to get ready for the audit, and you have to do things in your environment. And basically, SWIFT says that you are going to segment your set of SWIFT workloads that run SWIFT applications from the rest of your network. So that's a driver for doing segmentation. Other times we see is when you have an aftermath of a breach. You got breached, damage was done, and now you have to get ready so that this doesn't happen again, or make sure that you limit the damage because somebody is inside your network and you found out they've exfiltrated their data. You don't know how many other places they are in at, so you need to do something about it. So that tends to be a driver as well. Another one that we see is also, believe it or not, is internal compliance. So you have a law firm that is a custodian of records for Bank of America, as an example. Now, that law firm may not have any, regulatory requirements in terms of an audit, but they probably get audited by Bank of America. And Bank of America will say, well, if you don't have certain things in place, we won't do business with you. So there are those kinds of internal audit kinds of situations as well, even if you're not in a regulatory environment. And then, of course, we always see the cases where organizations are undergoing digital transformation, they're undergoing a data center refresh, and they take that opportunity to do the security right and do it in a manner that meets their requirements. So I would say compliance, aftermath of a breach, mergers and acquisitions, or internal compliance types of situations. Some customers, they just even want to get visibility. What do I need to get to just to be able to see how applications are talking to each other? So that tends to be a driver for segmentation as well.
Okay, excellent, excellent. So here's the results on the screen of the poll. 43% said yes, they are actively considering a segmentation project. What's your take, Faraz?
I think this is very much in line with what we see. Over the last 12 to 18 months, a lot more customers actually have committed themselves to doing projects and funded those projects. And that's where I believe that I see, if I had done this session and we had done this poll last year, I would bet probably the yes would be lower than 43 and the no would be more than 57. So what this tells me, and it is consistent with what we see out there, is that more and more enterprise organizations are making these projects a priority, and they're moving ahead by funding these projects, putting money behind these projects, and budgeting them. And that's what makes it real. So, I've had the analysts sometimes ask me that, why do you say, Faraz, that this is now becoming more real, or we see this as the year where security segmentation becomes mainstream? It's because we have started to see customers put money behind these projects and funding them.
Absolutely. All right, great. Well, I'll hand it back to you, Faraz.
All right, great. So what we're going to do is we're going to dive into some details. I think I need to be in slideshow mode. Okay, great. So what we're going to do is we are going to talk a little bit about some of the guiding principles. And we have learned a few things in terms of how customers have deployed the security segmentation and have been successful with it. And we have taken those learnings. We have also done our own point of view and come up with areas that you can actually take this message and come up with a strategy to deploy the solution. So let's take a step back and talk through this. We left it at decoupling. So that first step of decoupling allows you to separate the two environments, which makes it easy. And why is that important is because up till now, you had been writing security policies using IP addresses and VLANs. And I always, hear this thing, the classic case, we just recently dealt with a bank, and they came in and they said that, well, we need to protect this 300 servers out of the 10,000 we have in our data center. That's part of our Swift environment. And we didn't start with 300 servers. We started with 3 or 30, and over a period of a few years, this has grown. And now it's across actually 2 of our data centers in different, VLANs and subnets and everything. What we want to do is pluck out these 300 servers out of 10,000 plus servers, regardless of where they are, and put them together in a bubble so nothing talks into it or out of it. How do you do this? If you're going to try and do this with IP addresses, it's a nightmare. So that's where the decoupling comes in. That if you decouple the aspect of securing your devices, so we are not changing any IP addresses or VLANs or anything about the workload. We are just describing or looking at the workload through a different lens instead of IP addresses and VLANs. So that's the segue that I wanted to do is, if you want to do security segmentation correctly and do it without a lot of pain, there's a couple of things you need to put in place. The first thing is you need a way to group things logically, not based on IP addresses or VLANs, because they're tied to the networking constructs. And you can't just say, I'm going to take all these 300 servers in the case of this customer and say, move them out into one nice little subnet or VLAN and I'm done. Well, that's because you're going to have to re-IP, move the devices, take a downtime. All of these are no-goes. So what really it is that you are actually going to look at your environment and your workload in your applications through a different lens and group things together. And I'll talk to you what that lens is. The second thing is customers need a map. What they can't see, they can't secure. They need to be able to see how applications are talking to each other. Not a network map, but an application dependency map. And third, the very critical thing is customers need a way to model and test policies before enforcing them. Because that is a real problem today. When you write an access list on a router or a firewall or something, how do you know that that is completely correct? That's the only way you know is when you get the phone call when somebody complains and says that, why did you break my application? You don't have a way of really trialing that out. And if there is something, you can correct it or take your time to make sure that the policies are accurate. So first thing, creating logical grouping of things. So this is a very important step, which is really you are decoupling from IP addresses and VLANs. So rather than describe a workload or a machine as this is this IP address and this is this VLAN, you say that this particular workload is a web server or is a database or is an application server, meaning what role does it play? The second sort of dimension you give it is the application. Okay, you're a web server for which application? A SAP application, a CRM, an HRM, whatever might be the case. The third dimension is the environment. So you are a web server for a CRM application. Is it in development or is it in production? Is it in staging? Is it a regulated environment, non-regulated environment? And then last but not the least is a location. You could be an application server for a HR application in staging environment in California or New York or my AWS environment, wherever it might be. And what we have found is that this way of looking at workloads and describing it is very consistent at how the business looks at the applications and how the business works. So rather than describing a workload in IP addresses or VLANs, you're actually giving it certain labels that actually are aligned with how your business runs and how your business looks at it. Now, where do these labels come from? So these labels or this contextual data, metadata, can come from a variety of different places. Many large enterprise customers use a CMDB. And yes, I know many of you might feel that our CMDB is not the most 100% accurate, and that is fine. Actually, a byproduct of using Illumio and the illumination and our technologies, we actually help you clean the CMDB. Because by way of us seeing the map, we can actually say that, hey, this particular workload is not talking to anything in this application. It probably has been mislabeled. It's not even part of that application. So that's sort of the first step you need, is a way of describing the workload that is consistent with your business rather than using networking constructs. So that's the way of looking at logical groups. So CMDB is one example. It could come from vCenter. It could come from any system of records. It could be an IP address management system. It could be just even a plain old spreadsheet that you have, which says, hey, this host name, this IP address is this web server, whatnot. So if once you logical things, now you're going to look at it that lens and say, hey, I have these 100 workloads in my environment, and then I have these 23 workloads that are part of the Swift application. Some of them are web servers, some of them are application servers, some of them are databases, and they're all part of production. So that gives you a very different view than saying that I have this 10.10.bits in this VLAN 3. It doesn't tell you anything. The second thing is the value of the map. So the map is really your starting point because that is a shared view of the truth. You may not know how that application works as a network person, but you may have an app developer or a service owner who understands the application. And by way of looking at the map, there's actually the way to build common ground. You can actually look at things and say, oh, okay, I see this flow over here. My database is talking to this another database, or I have this web server trying to connect directly into the database. That should not be allowed. It should always go through the application layer. So this really is your first point of defining what you want for security. It allows you to collaborate with different groups, and that is how accurate policies are driven, because the network person may not know everything that the application needs or the flows. The app developer knows that, but the app developer doesn't really understand the network. So really this thing helps you come or bring both these parties together and build a shared view of truth. We have seen compliance teams, the NetOps teams, and the security teams, and at times even the application owners gather around, get together with this map and say, oh, okay, this is the policy for this app. That's what makes sense. The other thing it does, it also helps you during audit situations. So when the auditor comes in, they can actually visually look at this map and see that, oh, here's my Swift application. All the workloads that are part of the Swift, it's completely separated from the rest of the network. And they have these labels, and it tells them this is a web server for Swift in the production environment, rather than, hey, I have this 10.8.3.1 segregated. That doesn't mean anything for the auditor. So there's really a lot of value built in behind this map. And the third and a very important critical element is a way to model policies and test them before enforcing them. So once you have this map, once you have the security posture, then you start defining, hey, here are all the policies that need to go in there. And then you need a way to test them, because you can't be 100% sure that everything has been accounted for, all of the flows and everything. I'll give you an example. Sometimes you have certain batch jobs that might run only at the end of a quarter. That flow will come up only when that job kicks in. The app developer probably knows that, hey, we do a quarterly, tape backup because the database needs to resync with the new copy or something, whatever might be the case. But the point being is you need a way of actually testing that policy out without breaking the application. So that way you can say, okay, great, I saw this flow or this particular communication that is not part of the policy, but I'm going to allow it and I'm going to flag it so somebody can take a look at it and say whether it should be, is it legit or not? And then once we feel all comfortable, I can say, yep, and then put it into full enforcement mode. Most network-based techniques using IP addresses, VLANs, access list, firewall zone will not allow you to do this kind of a thing. And this is really important because what you are now doing is segmentation without risk. You are not afraid that I'm going to break the application. So your fundamental step of decoupling, getting a map, and the ability to walk through the policy and deploy it after testing it gives you the ability to segment your environment. And the segmentation that you choose can be dependent very much on what you really are doing. So what's going to happen is that you may have certain applications that need higher granularity versus others. Sometimes we see customers, they might just even say, okay, great, as a quick win, I'm just going to do environmental segmentation, separate everything in my development from my production. And that should be the first thing. Quick win, low-hanging fruit. Other times you might say, okay, I have this application, which is my asset management application. I want to make sure I take that entire application and ring fence it, or make sure that nothing goes in or nothing comes in or goes out unless I say so. At other times, you're actually going to do tier-based segmentation, where you might say, I actually have a 3-tier application, and I have my web tier, processing tier, and database. Rather than putting entire application in a bubble, I'm actually going to take the tiers and say web can talk to processing, processing can talk to database, web cannot directly talk to database. Actually, the last part in a whitelist model is redundant because only what you say is allowed, everything else is disallowed. And at times, if let's say you are dealing with regulatory environments and things like that, you may even go down to the process level segmentation, where you might say, I actually have a process running in my web layer, and I'm only going to allow it to run on this port and for this particular service. So you have that granularity all the way from left to right, as you see, and different applications may have different requirements even within the same organization. So let's tell you how Illumio does it. Illumio's architecture is actually very straightforward. It's a complete software-based solution. There's no hardware racking, stacking, cabling involved. And the way it starts is two pieces of software. The first piece of small software is an agent that we call the virtual enforcement node. And this agent sits on every workload that you're trying to protect, whether it's a bare metal server, virtual machine, container host, and they could reside anywhere. It could be in your data center. It could be in multiple public clouds. What this agent does is it actually is a very low footprint agent. It does not really crack the packets or modify the kernel or take the packets out of the kernel or anything like that. It basically collects information about the workload, its IP address, open ports, who is it talking to, the processes that are running, who is talking to it, etc. All of this rich contextual information is sent to the second piece of software that we call the policy compute engine. So the policy compute engine, think of it as the central brain. It does all the heavy lifting. And two specific things it does. One is it will take in metadata and from CMDB or whatnot and create an application dependency map. And second, it will allow you to create natural language-based policies with the labels that we talked about, rather than using IP addresses and VLANs. This policy compute engine will take the information and compute correct, precise layer 3 and layer 4 rules that are needed on the host to make sure that this posture stands. And these instructions are sent down to the agent, to the virtual enforcement node, which then takes these instructions and programs them into the host's stateful firewall. So yes, it does not do the enforcement itself. Actually, I've always had all the enforcement capabilities you needed that reside in the OS. Customers just didn't have a good way of activating them and orchestrating them at scale, which Illumio has solved that problem. But essentially, those instructions will be programmed in the case of a Windows server into the Windows filtering platform, in the case of Linux in IP tables, and similar mechanisms exist in Solaris and AIX. So this circle of life is very adaptive. Anytime workload moves or scale up or scale down, you don't need to rewrite the policies. It's very adaptive. Policy compute engine will recompute the policies and send it back to the agent. Something also very interesting we have done is we now actually have the ability to ingest vulnerability data from our vulnerability partners that we have done the integration work with, the three top players, Qualys, Nessus, and Rapid7. We can actually ingest this data and overlay it on an application dependency map, which actually allows you to visualize your risk and quantify that, and then actually use microsegmentation as a compensating control when you can't patch. And we'll touch on that a little bit as well. So from an architectural standpoint, it's very straightforward. And the big things that you really get out of it is first is an application dependency map. Use an example of what it could look like in your environment. Again, what you will see over here is 5 different application sets and green lines and red lines. And green lines mean that that's a communication flow that has been observed and a policy has been written for it. And a red one means that there is a flow, but there is no policy for it as yet. Maybe it's legit, maybe it's not. Somebody needs to say, does it make sense? In fact, in this particular case, if I look at the top left, that ordering application in the production environment in US, I see that web layer, one of the hosts, it is actually trying to reach out to all kinds of devices in other applications. That would kind of tell me that, hey, it looks like there's something going on that workload. Maybe there's a malware or something. It's trying to do a recon and see where it can go. Or it may be legit traffic that your business needs that particular application talks to the other. So really, this is the way you would start thinking about your security posture. In terms of actually generating policies, this is a little bit of an eye chart. The text is small, but I just kind of wanted to give you a flavor. We can actually do different levels of granularity, as I mentioned earlier. Right now, what you're seeing is a workflow that we have built into our product for generating policies, and you have these different levels. The one that you see that is currently in the orange is app group level. And then below that, you see the policy. So this is what policy generator suggested. If I do a ring fencing, what it really means that all workloads can talk to all workloads for all services within this bubble. Or if I choose to, I can get granular by tier. As you can see now, I've chosen role tier level, and now I have separated out the tiers and the policies that are suggested to me. So it says that, hey, I can, my web layer can talk to my processes for all services, but my web cannot talk directly to database, as an example, which is implied. Or you can get down to port protocol, and you really get to tighten up the security posture and say, hey, I want this tier to talk to this tier, but only using this particular port and this particular protocol. So as you can see that there's level of granularity that's built into the workflow to devise the correct security policy. Something else, as I mentioned, we do is also be able to ingest vulnerability information. And this is something really important and key, because what happens is typically in an environment is you might have a vulnerability management team or a vulnerability group that has the tools, qualis, etc., and they will feed in IP addresses from your environment. It will spit out a report saying that, hey, here are the vulnerabilities that exist on these IP addresses or in this host, and the severity, critical, high, etc., the CVS score, and so on and so on. Now, it does give you information about vulnerabilities, but it doesn't provide it the context, meaning how vulnerable is my application or my environment? Yes, I know there is a vulnerability, but what is my patching priority? Let me pose this philosophical scenario for you. If you have a database that has a critical vulnerability and it is connected to your application layer, let's say 3 different workloads, all 3 of them are patched. That's one scenario. Versus you have a web server that is internet facing that has a medium vulnerability. Which one should you go and patch first? The answer is not as easy, because it also depends on how exposed you are. Just because there's a critical vulnerability in the database doesn't mean you should go there and patch first, because actually it is less risky. It is connected to machines that are already patched, and it has a very low exposure score, meaning how many different paths exist in my environment to come into this vulnerable port and do damage or take advantage of it. Versus the other scenario where I have only got a medium vulnerability, but it's exposed to the internet, it's exposed to the whole world. So the idea is that you actually take into account the exposure score. And you might say that, hey, you know what, hackers are actually weaponizing medium and low vulnerabilities increasingly. So actually, I'm going to go ahead and close off that medium vulnerability that is internet facing, versus going to that critical vulnerability in the database, just in terms of a priority. You still need to patch and patch everything. So the idea is that we actually give you the ability to visualize risk. Where does my risk reside? Is it in my database layer? Is it in my internet facing layer? And where exactly am I exposed? The second thing is we also help you quantify risk, which is this exposure score that I mentioned. This is actually a precise score that we calculate for you. And in the picture, it's kind of a little hard to read, but you will see the exposure score on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side. And what it really means is that if you have a vulnerability on a workload, on a particular port, then how many paths are there to get into that? The lower the exposure score, the better. The more the number, which means there are more number of paths I can go in and exploit that vulnerability. So we actually can now do certain things that make your life easy. Here's a scenario. You receive that report from your vulnerability team. You are an application owner or the owner of those workloads, and you say, okay, great. I actually now have got this report, and I think I have to patch, but I can't patch because there's no patch available for it. It's a zero-day vulnerability. Or it could be a case where the patch has not been tested. I already got burned last time I did it that way. Or it could just be, it's December production freeze. I can't take these workloads offline to patch. What do you do in those times? Well, during those times, you can actually use microsegmentation as a compensating control. And what you do is you use our workflow, and you use that 4th option of segmentation, and you say, I want to actually mitigate vulnerabilities. And what the system does, it uses these 2 concepts of limiting and closing of the ports. Essentially, the idea is if you have ports that have vulnerabilities in them and they're not being used by anybody, shut them off, close them off. Or if you have ports that have vulnerabilities, and yes, it is in use by application, do all the pathways leading to that port need to remain open? All that exposure score? Maybe not. So cut out the paths that you don't need and only keep the ones that are needed for the application to function open, meaning reduce the pathways. So by using these 2 concepts, we can use microsegmentation and tighten up the net, so that way you are reducing the risk in your environment. And this workflow actually allows you to do that. It suggests the policies, and it even tells you which vulnerabilities were mitigated by using this microsegmentation level. So, in terms of our customers, how they use Illumio and its product is in a variety of ways. Our customers sometimes start out with just even getting visibility, using the application dependency map to see how things are working, or if I need to move things around, I'm better off knowing what is where and how they communicate versus doing it blindly. Sometimes it's just environmental separation, like we talked about. Separate out the environments, that's a good enough win for me, or at least for this particular application. Or you might choose a specific application and ring fence it. and say, I want to protect it. Or you can go down very granular and do micro-segmentation and lock it down at port protocol level. At other times, we also see our customers use our technology and product to actually securely move to the cloud. You're migrating from on-prem to cloud. You want those applications to come up in the cloud and come up secure. Or if it's a new data center that you're trying to secure, that could have happened by way of M&A or just opening up a new data center. People also use our technology for user segmentation on VDI environments, because we actually have an integration with Microsoft Active Directory, so we know all the groups that exist and which group you are a member of. So we can actually have in a common shared VDI terminal, different users log in and get different levels of access. And then, of course, vulnerability information that we can overlay, and that provides tremendous flexibility to customers in driving patching priority, or reducing the risk while you can't patch because for any reason you don't have a patch or freeze or whatnot. So variety of ways in which our customers use our products. So again, the key benefits of Illumio is really the ability to visualize. It's really very IT friendly. That's one thing I hear from our customers who have deployed us. And we have many, many large scale production deployments that we have always had the philosophy, we want to fit in your environment and in your processes, how you run things, versus saying, here's how my widget works. You surround my, you change your practices to do it. So really, that's a key for us. And why customers select Illumio, I think I'll sort of leave it at that, where you may not know Illumio, but you probably know Illumio's customers, the one represented on the right-hand side, and all of them have chosen to work with their wallet and put their faith in Illumio to do this and solve this particular problem. So as sort of parting advice, I sort of wanted to give you a few different concrete steps that you could take in your environment for driving the projects when you have such requirements. So the first thing is you have to understand it's not just only about technology. It is also got a people and a process part. So as much as you might be on top of technology and things, there's still an element of people and process that you have to consider to get these things done right. So the first thing you need is the right tools. You need an application dependency map. Unless you have that, you're not going to be able to devise a good security posture. And you need that ability to drive policy from what you are seeing, not as two ships in the night, as two separate things. You want a solution that gives you that visibility, and based on that visibility and the information you provide will drive the right policies for you. And then also have the ability to not only just drive and write those policies, but be able to enforce them. So that's going to be the right tools. You need these tools to get it done right. Second, you always are going to start somewhere. As I mentioned earlier, you can't segment everything at once. You can't just get up and say, I'm going to segment, so I'm going to start segmenting. So you have to see where you're going to get your greatest return. What's most valuable to you? What are your crown jewel applications? Are you in a regulated environment? What is the harm if this particular set of devices or data goes out? So these are all things that will go into your posture. You also need to see the application owner's relationship and how you are going to be able to bring them to the table to drive this policy. So it's really important to understand where are you going to start and what are the things you need in terms of other things, people, whether it's a compliance, auditor environment, et cetera, et cetera. The third is that you have to map your environment, and this should be real-time and accurate. This can't be a case of I am doing a pull and I have that map and I wrote my policy, and then it wasn't real-time. It never showed me what's really going on. It was a snapshot in time. The ability to test and enforce. This is going to take you a long, long ways, because otherwise you'll be sitting there doing stuff and getting this phone call as to why did you break my application. So the ability to build a policy, model it, and test it before you actually put it into enforcement 100% is the key. And many, or I should say almost every single one of our customers that is in production scale deployment, they've gone through this process of testing before enforcing. And last but not the least, decide what you're going to segment next. This is an iterative approach. You are probably going to start somewhere and then say, okay, great, what am I going to do next? A lot of our customers we see, they will start with a regulated environment driven by compliance. They become successful over there, pass the audit, and then they will say, okay, great, now I want to look at my core services, my Active Directory, DNS, etc., lock those down. Or it may be my other crown jewel applications. So again, decide what to segment next, repeat the process again. So this is sort of a little stepped recipe, if you will, that will help you get your arms around these projects and come out successful at the other end. So start with visibility, test policy before enforcing. You'll make many friends. A segment in phases. Don't try to segment everything at once. Pick your applications and see if you can get them done, and then get the results, and then move on. Build partnerships with your teams. As I mentioned, this is not just about technology. It's a lot about people and processes as well. If you build the right relationships with your teams between security, application owners, service owners, etc., this will go a long way, and your chances of success are going to be much higher. And last but not the least, every successful security segmentation project that I have seen has had an internal champion in the customer organization who actually make sure that all the parties come together. Call it an executive sponsor, call it a person who cares the most, call it a person whose neck is on the line, but you do need an internal champion to drive these projects. So that's sort of what I wanted to share with you. Happy to answer any questions you might have, or anything that you might want to ask related to this technology or Illumio.
Great presentation, Faraz. We do have some really good questions that came in here for you. Let's see. First one, Brandon is asking, do you have any recommendations on how to sell security to the business when the business just, wants access to everything? Basically, they say, just secure it all, but might not be always happy with the price tag for that. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, sure. So a couple of different things. Number one, if you can actually, the best way to sell it to the business is by way of showing, let's say if you're in an environment that is under regulation or compliance, then it becomes a more straightforward conversation, because usually there is either a penalty or consequences at the end of it if you don't pass audit. So that's a little simpler one, because if you say, hey, I have a Swift environment, we have an audit coming up, we need to secure this environment, I think that is a little easier conversation. But at the larger level, how to sell security to business is by way of actually showing the impact that if we do not lock down our applications, if we ever got breached, we do have a free skating environment that anybody could come in and do this. The second, it's not always just the outsiders who are trying to get in to do this thing. It could sometimes be an insider threat or an insider mistake that you actually are doing things that you should not be doing, and that can take your service down. The service impact and the cost of the business, if you have to do PR, if you do have to manage the aftermath of a breach, these are all very expensive things and reputation shattering things. I think that's what really the business gets. Now, the other side of the coin is that business looks at everything in terms of risk, and how much am I willing to pay to minimize that risk. And if you can come up with a mechanism that tells them you can do this with, without much pain and less expensively, which actually Illumio helps you to do, because we are a complete software solution. You're not buying firewalls, you're not buying switches and routers and TCAM and adding memory to it to do this thing. You actually are going to find a more, palatable solution at a, more reasonable price, and is much more effective. So leaving Illumio aside, I would say it is always about identifying the risk to the business and the impact to the service and your customers. That sells. If you're under compliance, then it's obviously a very straightforward conversation.
Right. Okay. Good advice. Next question here. Morgan is asking, how often do the policies need to be reviewed and updated?
Okay. So every organization is different. The policies are always adaptive and always remain in step lock. As an example, if you wrote a policy for an application and that application had 20 workloads and now you scaled it down to 15, you don't need to do anything. The policies are adaptive, and it will make sure that policies are now applied to those 15 workloads. The 5 that you scaled down have gone away from the tables. There is no notion of that workload anywhere. So in that sense, it's adaptive. In terms of actually, I've also seen organizations do audits on rules and policies, internal audits. And that's where they'll say, okay, great, this policy was written 6 months ago for this application. We know there have been changes into the environment, meaning this application now does not talk to this asset management or inventory control application anymore. So we need to make changes because that pathway is still open. So there are larger organizations who drive internal security audits where they review policies for all applications, or application owners or service owners sit down with the network and SecOps teams or CISO team to say, okay, we have 300 applications in our environment. These are the 50 that we have actually paid more attention to in terms of locking them down. Here are the policies associated with them. So let's take a look at it. So in terms of if something happens in the network or some active flow changes or workload up and down, those are taken care of by the adaptive nature of the solution. The policy audits are from a more organizational standpoint. How often should we look and change? It's an organizational thing, but we do provide tooling in our product as well as reporting so that it will tell you that, hey, this policy has been around for this application. This was the last time it was reviewed or changed, etc. Hopefully that helps you, Morgan.
Yeah, great answer. Another question here, Brandon is asking, does this work on the client side too, or would I just run it in the data center on the server side?
Right. So this is currently only data center, whether it's in your on-prem or public clouds. The focus for Illumio has been on servers, not on end-user devices and workstation. But having said that, there are certain things that we do that are outside of strictly the server environment. When I say a server workload, which has an OS, and anywhere it resides in any form factor. So outside of that realm, we actually do get a little bit into the user segmentation space with our VDI solution, which I talked about. We also actually have enforcement capabilities that we can do on switches and routers, specifically Cisco and Arista. And this is actually more of, sometimes our customers have asked, hey, I have an AS400. There is no agent for AS400. How can I control some level of communication? So we can actually now, just like we push those rules and instructions into the OS's firewall, we can actually push those rules onto a Cisco or Arista switch. And you can now have some level of protection on that first incoming switch port where the AS400 or something that doesn't have an agent is connected to. So we do get a little bit outside of the server environment. But I would say, as an answer, we have focused on servers that run applications. At some point, who knows, fast forward, Illumio becomes so successful that customers ask us to do other things in user space as well. And we would like to be there if that's the case.
Okay, nice. And you mentioned, Cisco and Arista. Luis is asking, is this dependent on certain hardware brands and models?
Actually, very strictly speaking, it's not, because it is the the language of the OS. That's what we have done the work for. So tomorrow, if you had an Extreme or an HP switch, if you can translate, Cisco or Arista config ACLs, permit IP, any, whatever is the syntax, and there are tools that are available, you can actually put it in there. I will caveat this, though, is that if you write overly fine-grained rules and then try to push it into the switch, be careful, because you may have limited TCAM space.
Got it.
And by the way, we can do the same thing on F5 load balancers as well.
Oh, nice. Okay. Next question here. Shiva is asking, does your solution support hybrid environments with single pane of glass management?
That is true. Yes, we do. Our solution covers hybrid environment, meaning you can have your workloads, your assets on your on-prem, public cloud, multiples of them, hosted environment, doesn't matter. In terms of form factor, also, it doesn't matter. So yes, we do support a complete hybrid environment, and you do get a single pane of glass. So if you have assets in your data center, in Amazon, in GCP, you actually are going to be able to see policy, device policies, and do everything from the same policy compute engine that you are using. Now, having said that, we also know that a lot of our, larger customers, I should say, our entire system is API driven. So everything that you do in our system, you can actually make API calls. And there are customers who have developed their own homegrown single pane of glass or a system that they are using. So they actually may not sit in front of the Illumio screen. They will be making API calls all day long. That's yet another proof we do not dictate that you have to fit into our way of doing things. We can actually fit into your environment. So the answer to the question, yes, we do operate in hybrid environment. Yes, we do offer a single pane of glass, but we also do offer the ability for a customer to be able to operate this whole thing from their single pane of glass using API calls, if that's how they wanted to do it.
Okay, excellent. And then another question here. Paul is asking, if we select Illumio, do you have professional services or partners or someone to help with the implementation?
Absolutely. In fact, we do make sure that our customers are successful. We onboard them so that they are, positioned for success. So professional services plays a very key role in that.
Nice, nice. And then I know we're running out of time here. Before we go, last question I wanted to ask you is, what should people do to get started? I think you have a slide right after this that talks about the test drive.
That is correct. So we have made it easy for our customers to experience Illumio and get it into their environment. And there are a couple of different ways they can do that. We have a guided tour that is available on our website. This is an introduction to the system, what kind of things you will see when you operate, the screens, the capabilities. So it's more guided. We also have another option of a free trial for 30 days that you can download the software and get started. That is yet another way to try it out in your environment. And then we can also do custom proof of concepts. So we can engage with you, define a test plan, do a demo, and then kind of devise some security policies for your environment and see how it works for you.
Very nice, very nice. Well, this has been a really educational event. Faraz, thank you so much for being on the event today.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Have a great day.
And for everyone out there in the audience, the winner of the $300 Amazon gift card is, here we go. I had it up. Is Linda White of Tennessee. Congratulations, Linda White.
Congratulations, Linda.
And for more information, I encourage you to check out Illumio for yourself. Go to illumio.com/TD for test drive. I also put that link right there in the GoToWebinar chat pane. If you want to just click on the link, you can do that. You can also try out the attack surface quiz for yourself, and there's a link there to do that as well. Thank you, Illumio, for sponsoring this event, and thank you everyone out there in the audience for joining today's event. I hope you learned a lot. See you on the next event.